So I'm just going to share my slides with everyone. Okay, can you all see my slides? Yeah, good. Okay. Okay, so as Douglas mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what is the impact of age on voting in the UK. As I'm about to show you, it's become a quite significant predictor. Everyone is interested in age and in why it matters so much more. So we're going to explore a little bit what's happening there and what it means for the future. So you might have come across these graph. It was in the Financial Times a couple of years ago. And essentially, what it's showing is that millennials are the first generation that is defying this long established trend of becoming more conservative as you grow older. In the past, by the time you were 35, 40, your allegiances would start to shift towards the parties on the right. But this is not really the case anymore. And not only are millennials not shifting right, but they're actually shifting more and more to the left as they grow older. And in the UK, this has become such a predominant feature of the political system that from about 2015, 2017, many political commentators started to say that age had replaced class as the defining cleavage in British voting behavior. In the past, if you were working class or middle class, would really determine how you voted. But today, it's much more a question of whether you are young or old. With the association being that the younger you are, the more likely you are to support Labour. The older you are, the more likely you are to support the Conservatives. This has obviously shifted a little in the last couple of years with more parties coming in, but they're still the attachments are still within the same party families, let's say. And in my research, I have looked into this age gap a lot. I did my entire PhD trying to explain where is it coming from and what is going to happen. And a nice way to visualize this age gap in the sorry, wait, there we go. A nice way to visualize this age gap in the UK is to look at it in terms of what is the probability of choosing the Labour Party over the Conservative Party. And as we can see here, younger people, who are defined by the red line, have always been slightly more likely than older ones to choose Labour over the Conservatives. But this gap has become huge. What we see here is that from 2015, it's grown at every election, and even though in 2024 even older people were more likely to choose the Conservatives, the gap is still as big as it was in the election before. So it doesn't really show any signs of narrowing, rather it's becoming bigger. And in my research, I have explored three mechanisms that might explain what is happening. The first mechanism is intergenerational value change. So, this idea that the reason why younger and older people have different partisanship allegiances is because they've started to have increasingly different political orientations. The second mechanism that I've looked at is this idea of the delayed transition into adulthood. Young adults today stay young for longer, and therefore this means that their partisan allegiances that are associated with youth persist for longer throughout their lifetimes. And the third mechanism has to do with party appeals. So, what is the role of parties in attracting certain age groups over others? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all three of these mechanisms. So the first one is about changing values. So you might remember that from about 2016 onwards, there was a lot of media commentary around this idea that millennials were overwhelmingly socialist. They espoused socialist ideals. They supported leaders like Corbyn in the UK or Bernie Sanders in the US. And also at the same time that young people were increasingly woke, increasingly progressive, and therefore that the reason why we see this age gap is effectively because young people are becoming more radical, moving more towards the radical left in their attitudes. And At the same time, these changes in values have been attributed to the expansion of higher education. We know that if you have a degree now tends to mean that you have certain political leanings. So a lot of scholars, but also media commentators, have started to define this new cleavage as an education cleavage. It doesn't really matter how much money you make, but rather whether you have a degree or not in terms of how you vote. And the Blair government has been credited with creating a generation of Labour voters specifically because they invested so much into the expansion of education and of higher education in particular. So I've looked at, sorry, let me go back. So the first hypothesis that I've looked at is whether this age gap that we're seeing is because young people are more highly educated and therefore more likely to espouse socially liberal and economically left-wing values. And the way I've done this is by creating two measures of economic values, one measure of economic values, one measure of sociocultural values. For economic values, we look at policy attitudes such as views on redistribution, whether people get their fair share of the nation's wealth, whether big businesses have too much power, and whether there is a different law for the rich and poor. So we combine the answers to all of these questions into an index. And if you are more likely to be right-wing, you would score over 0 in this index, whereas if you are more likely to be left-wing, you would score below 0. And for sociocultural values, we look at questions around support for the death penalty, whether young people don't have respect for traditional values, whether censorship is necessary to uphold moral standards, and whether criminals should be given stiffer sentences. And again, here, values above 0 mean that you are more liberal, whereas values above 0 mean you're more authoritarian, whereas values below 0 mean that you are more liberal. And if we look at age shifts on these attitudes, we see that there isn't really a difference by age in terms of economic attitudes. So this talk of millennial socialists isn't really true. They're not significantly different from older people. But what we do see is that all age groups have become slightly more left-leaning when it comes to the economy, even though they all kind of move in tandem. So over the last couple of years, everyone is slightly more economically left-wing. Where we do see, however, some really large age differences is on these so-called sociocultural liberal values. So we see that young people are, across all of the years we look at, young people are much more liberal than older ones because they're all on the kind of lower end of this spectrum. But we also see that every age group has become more liberal over time. So even though there is a consistent gap between the young and old, there is a trend of moving towards more socially liberal positions across the board. And in terms of what's the impact of education on this, we see that it tends to mirror the impact that age has on this value. So there is probably a strong association between the two. Whereas in the past, having a degree meant that you were slightly more economically right-wing because the line of those who are degree educated is on the right-wing end of the spectrum. In the last couple of years, education doesn't really differentiate your economic views anymore. Everyone is, again, moving left, and it doesn't really matter whether you're degree educated or not. Where it does continue to matter is, again, for sociocultural values, because we see that those who are degree educated are considerably more liberal in their views than those who are not. So it is probably true that there is this association. But the next thing that I wanted to know was which one matters most for voting. Is it education or is it the values that come with education? And this is what I've done here. So just to explain a little bit about what's happening in this graph, here I'm measuring how much certain values impact your support for certain parties. And again, if you're looking at values above 0, it means that these are right-wing or authoritarian values, whereas below 0, they are left-wing or liberal values. And across the board, we see that values really matter mostly for voting for the two main parties, the Conservatives, as evidenced by the blue line, and Labour, as evidenced by the red line. The impact of these values was slightly smaller during the Blair governments, but then it increased again after. And now it's starting to contract a little bit. When it comes to liberal authoritarian values, we see the opposite. We see that these values in the last election didn't just matter for Labour and the Conservatives, but they also mattered for smaller parties. For example, a Reform, which is the purple line here, a person who was authoritarian in 2024 was more likely to vote Reform than the Conservatives, and also more likely to abstain from voting. But how much does this differ by age? That's what we see here. So apologies. So the impact of these values across the under 35s and the under 60s is not wildly different, but it is a little bit different. For example, we see that in 2024, being economically right-wing made an individual aged under 35 just as likely to abstain as it did to vote, to make them vote conservative, whereas being economically left-wing meant that they were equally likely to choose the Greens or or Labour. So these smaller parties are starting to attract people with these values more. And it's the same for liberal authoritarian values. We see that the gap in between the Greens and Labour is narrowing in 2024, and that the Reform has overtaken the Tories in terms of attracting these young voters with authoritarian attitudes. Similar thing happening with the over 60s, even though they still have a much stronger allegiance to the two main parties, Labour and Conservatives, when it comes to economic values. But with liberal authoritarian values, we see that Reform has overtaken the Conservatives in attracting these voters. But the Greens have not overtaken Labour. If anything, in 2024, voters who had strong liberal values were much more likely to vote Labour than anyone else. Now, we obviously don't have the data in terms of what's happening now because there hasn't been an election yet. But given recent trends, I suspect that these effects will be even more pronounced given what's happened over the last couple of years. And in terms of the impact of education, that too does affect voting, not as much as values, but we see that having a degree now matters a lot more than it did before, and it matters for Labour in particular. Since 2015, the impact of having a degree on choosing the Labour Party has grown at each election, and it was really large in 2024 as well. Now, there are some scholars that are saying that education doesn't really matter as much because it's become so common and therefore it doesn't really make as much of a difference. But what this data shows is actually the opposite. Even though there are more graduates, being a graduate now seems to define your vote even more than it did in the past. So that's something to think about. And in terms of where this leaves us for the hypothesis that it is value change and education that drive these gaps in attitudes, we see that values and education do affect voting and that the impact of these values has increased in recent years, and it now differentiates support across various parties. Education is especially important for Labour voters. But what I've also seen in this analysis is that even though I take into account these aspects into the model, the age gap remains. So alone, they're not enough as an explanation. There is something else going on that doesn't pertain values and education. And so the next hypothesis that I've looked at is about whether this gap is not so much about education and values, but rather about the socioeconomic background of voters. So we know that younger generations are much more highly educated, but they're also much less likely to earn the same amount of money than their parents did at the same age. They are less likely to have moved out of the parents' home or to have bought their own home, less likely to be married, and less likely to have kids. And all of these things affect how you vote because they determine what your priorities are in life and in society. So a lack of these key life events will mean that you have different preferences and orientations. And this is something that in political science we call delayed maturation or delayed transition into adulthood. So we could consider this maturation process as a move from roles that are typical of adolescence and early adulthood to to roles that are typical of later adulthood. So things like starting full-time work, moving out of your parents' house, getting married, and having kids. So what's happened in the last couple of decades is that the expansion of educational systems means that we now stay in school or university for longer. Therefore, we enter the job market later. And because of various financial crises, we don't quite have the right level of wealth to move out of our parents' house, buy our own, and start a family. So, in a sense, the early maturation patterns could be considered early, contracted, and simple. It was early because all of these key life events happened relatively early after you left school. It was contracted because they tended to happen quite quickly. You know, there was a quite quick progression from one of these stages to the next. And it was simple because you would do these things in a somewhat clear order. You know, first you leave school, then you get your job, you buy your house, you get married and have kids. But what's happening today is that the trend is late because these things happen much later than they used to. It's protracted because a lot of time can pass in between each of these life events. It could be 5 to 10 years in between getting married and having a child. And it's complex because these events no longer really happen in a clear order. Sometimes one moves out of the parents' home and then moves back in, or you get married and you divorce. So it's changed how we conceptualize this idea of passing from adolescence to adulthood. And all of these life events are also known to affect political preferences because we know from research that if you buy a house, you're more likely to become right-leaning. If you get married, you're more likely to become right-leaning. In fact, in the United States, the marriage gap is even more prevalent than the gender gap. You know, whether a woman is married matters so much more for them voting Republican than their own gender does. And having children as well does affect political attitudes, although the research there is mixed because some studies find that it depends on the gender of the parent and others that it depends on the gender of the child. So having daughters makes a father slightly more liberal, whereas having sons makes him more conservative. But again, the evidence is mixed. What we know is that these things matter. So a lack of these experiences will also matter for how we vote. And what we also see is that there has been a consistent decrease in the rate at which young people do all of these things. And the biggest decrease pertains getting married and having kids. You know, for the pre-war or silent generation, over 80% of people aged under 35 would have done both of these things. For millennials, that's down to 40%. So the rate of young people who complete these things has basically halved over time. And if we combine all of these life events into an index, which I call a maturation index, we see that the decrease tends to mirror what's happened with the support for the Conservative Party. So the two might be related. It might be that young people are less likely to vote for Conservative parties because they lack the socioeconomic incentives to vote for them. They haven't, you know, they don't have the same priorities as the people who do support them. And when I ran this analysis, so this is the hypothesis that I was just talking about. And when I ran this analysis, we see that that is in fact the case. Sorry, I don't know why my slides keep skipping. The maturation index has a quite strong and large effect on voting Conservative, which means that the more mature you are, the more likely you are to shift right. And I want to clarify that when I say mature, I don't mean that someone who hasn't done these things is immature, obviously, but rather that by this conceptualization, they haven't matured into these various stages of adulthood at the same rate as in the past. And what we've also seen in this analysis is that this is especially true for millennials. So, because doing these things is quite rare and quite unusual across younger generations, those individuals who do them have a much stronger likelihood of shifting right than in previous generations. And I believe that this is probably because these individuals have considerably different lifestyles than their peers. They probably don't really hang out with their peers that much because, having kids completely changes your entire existence, and therefore you're more likely to maybe be socializing with older people who also have kids rather than with your own friends who don't. And therefore your voting behavior then tends to mirror that of older groups. And in terms of implications, these, if for when the Conservative Party was in government, this meant that they technically had an incentive in helping younger people complete these transitions earlier, because then they would have made them more likely to vote for them. But now that there is a party on the left in government, obviously benefiting from this delayed transition because these generations are less likely to align with the right. But at the same time, there's a risk there because every party in government suffers from so-called incumbency effect. So, it gets blamed for basically anything that goes wrong in people's lives. And it is quite possible that someone aged 30 to 35 who is struggling to buy a house, maybe wants to start a family but doesn't feel financially stable enough to do that, will blame the current government, regardless of the fact that these things would technically make them more right-leaning. So this delayed maturation is technically good news for a party like Labour, but it also comes with a whole host of risks if it becomes associated with making it more difficult for people to do these things. And then the third mechanism that I've looked at is about parties. What role does a party have in attracting certain age groups more than others? Now, we know that the Conservative Party had a really bad reputation across young people for a very long time, whereas Labour was considered the party of the youth, especially since the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader. The party started to really put a lot of effort into attracting young voters. In 2017, they even had a dedicated youth manifesto, which I don't think other parties did. So there was really an effort there to enfranchise and mobilize these voters. And I was interested in how much is the age gap a product of this, of the fact that different parties are really putting a different level of effort in attracting voters. And this is what we call in political science a supply side explanation, because so far we've looked at what do individuals do that affects their voting behavior, but obviously parties have a huge role in attracting certain voters. So here the hypothesis that I'm looking at is whether the reason why young people are so left-leaning is that left parties simply talk to them more. And the way I've tested this was with a survey experiment that I ran in 2022. So this was obviously before other parties became popular in the political arena. And I basically asked a representative sample of Britain to consider two fictional candidates. One was Labour and one was Conservative. And each of these candidates made a different appeal to these individuals. The control group, so the group that I'm comparing things against, only saw a really vague message that said, if you elect me, I will do everything in my power to champion the interests of my constituents. But then the other appeals were a symbolic appeal saying, we spent so much focusing on the needs of the elderly. It's time that we focus on the needs and the interests of the youth. The cultural appeal was about expanding trans rights. And then I had two economic appeals, one about tuition fees, so an issue that is extremely pertinent to young people. And here the appeal was to scrap them. and then to raise the minimum wage for everyone and to make it the same across under 21s and over. And these are all appeals that came from the Labour Manifesto, the 2017 manifesto. So they are appeals that technically people should have been more or less familiar with. But what I changed is that some of these appeals came from a conservative candidate rather than Labour, and I wanted to see how much does this affect support and does it alienate older voters if a candidate does this. And results suggest that all of the appeals worked for young people. They all made them more likely to support the candidate, except the appeal on trans rights, which has a positive effect, but it's not statistically significant. But all of the other appeals had a positive effect on the youth, regardless of whether the candidate was Conservative or Labour. And when it comes to older people, I was expecting here that these appeals would have made them less likely to support the candidate because these are things that older people either don't care about or they have negative views about. But actually, what happened is that old people just didn't care. It didn't really make a difference to them whether a candidate said any of these things. And this is interesting because obviously a party, when they're strategizing, they think, oh, if we say this, we might alienate this group. And older people are obviously much more likely to vote than young ones. So a party doesn't want to alienate them. But what this is showing is that actually it just doesn't really make a difference for them. And if anything, tuition fees has a small positive impact on them as well, which I believe is because they might be, if they have young people in their family, they might be more sensitive to the fact that it's a huge financial burden and people are struggling to pay for it. But what is interesting is that a conservative candidate who makes these appeals is able to close the gap with a Labour candidate who makes these appeals. So even though the Conservatives were obviously really not liked by young people at all, the moment a candidate said something that young people liked to hear, they said they were just as likely to support them as they were to support the Labour candidate. And this is really fascinating because again, it suggests that a party is not doomed. They can appeal to certain voters. And if we break it down by partisanship, it's the same thing, even across young Labour voters, so people who feel strongly aligned, a Conservative candidate was able to close the gap the moment they made the same appeal. Another interesting thing here is what's happened with older Labour voters with the minimum wage appeal, which had actually a negative effect across these voters if the candidate making the appeal was Labour. And I believe that that's because you kind of expect Labour to tell you that they're going to raise wages, so it doesn't really make existing partisans more likely to support them. And if anything, the wage increase that I proposed in this experiment was relatively small, so people might have even got annoyed. Whereas if the same appeal comes from a Conservative candidate, it's unexpected, and therefore it has a positive effect on their support. So in terms of the implications of this is that even though young people are skewed towards Labour, or as we know today, the Greens, parties that would normally not really make big headways across this cohort can do so if they simply focus on the issues that matters to these voters. And they can do so without triggering a backlash from older voters. So the Conservatives, I mean, at the time when I first prepared these presentations a few years ago, this was about what can the Conservatives do to win support, but I suppose that today it applies to Labour as well. They could regain popularity across young voters by simply focusing on the issues that are relevant to them without risking losing support. And I mean, this sounds obviously quite basic, but in the context of an election, when people are receiving all sorts of appeals from each other, it's important to know which ones can resonate more than not. And in terms of where this leaves us, it's what my research shows is that this is relatively good news for left parties because we know that with generational value change, everyone is becoming more liberal. So there is the potential across society to tap into these liberal values and mobilize them. But the bit that is not really good news is that we're now seeing growing gaps within younger generations. So we're now seeing a gap emerging around gender, with young women becoming considerably more left-leaning than ever before, and young men shifting slightly to the far right. Now, the levels of young men's support for reform are really not that huge. In fact, a couple of months ago, I was receiving lots of media requests from journalists asking me to comment on why young men were voting the far right en masse. And my answer was always, they really aren't. I mean, the youth remains left leaning on average, but there is this growing small group of young men that are considering these parties. I mean, again, it really depends on how good the parties are at mobilizing these values and these sentiments, and how much effort they put into speaking to them. But I guess there is a signal that we might be going into this direction, that the new cleavage isn't really age anymore, but it's gender. And that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I think we can open up to questions. Please, yeah, raise your hand or feel free to ask a question, dive straight in. If not, I do have a couple questions to ask, but I'm going to give everyone else a chance first. Okay. Okay, I'm going to break the ice. You mentioned the growing gender gap. Well, you ended off on the growing gender gap. This is something that is of, as you know, it's a pertinent issue of great interest to everyone. Hence all the calls you're getting from journalists. Um, what is the rate of this growth in the difference between um, young female voters and young male voters? I know you said it's still very small. By and large, it's only a kind of a small splinter group of male voters that are kind of young male voters that are sort of separating from the large body of young voters generally. But what is the rate of their growth, and how, if that rate of growth is maintained, how long might it be before it does become an important issue for everyone to really take notice of?
Yeah, so in 2024, there were about twice as many young women who voted for the Greens than men, and I believe that the actual numbers was 24% versus 12. Whereas for Reform, it was the opposite. It was 12% of young men voted Reform as opposed to 6% of young women. I believe that these numbers will obviously be higher at the next general election, but what I think it's important to remark upon is that there are still more young men voting Green than there are voting Reform. So even though the gap is sort of intensifying, the prevalence is still for young men to be left-leaning, but there is this growing minority, let's say. And this differs a little bit between the UK and other countries in Europe. There is much less appetite for the far right in the UK than in other places. And I don't think that that is because people are so much more liberal in the UK than they are in France or in Germany, but rather because in the UK, people who have these values just don't vote. They're not really mobilized to the same extent, whereas in other countries, possibly because these parties have been around for longer, they are likely to support them. It's a tricky situation with young people because their turnout levels in this country are really abysmal compared to the rest of Europe. I believe at the last election, only around 37 to 40% of young people voted. So a party like Reform is really going to struggle to attract voters when there is already such low turnout. But if they mobilize them correctly, and again, there's a lot of talk of their presence on TikTok and things like that. If they intensify these efforts, there is the chance that these voters will turn out to vote. But I think, yeah, it's important to remember that the youth in this country is still overwhelmingly left liberal, and this is mostly driven by young women today. Yeah.
Thank you. And again, if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or please feel free to jump right in. I do have another question. You mentioned that economic issues don't seem to sort of be that impactful on this change, but socio-cultural views seem to have a really big impact. To what extent do you think, I mean, this is phenomenon everyone is been talking about for years now, the culture wars. To what extent do you think the culture wars or the package, the combination of issues and topics that people associate with the culture wars has had an impact or in this socio-cultural values difference?
Yeah, a lot. I think that what we've seen in the last couple of elections was really a question of what are these social values of people rather than economic values. And I mean, in a way, it makes sense because people struggle to differentiate between parties' economic policies, and also, there is very little difference within society itself in terms of what their economic priorities are. Everyone wants, young people want home ownership as their top economic priority, but it's not like older people are against it. So technically, everyone is on board and on the same side. Where there is a gap is on the other sociocultural values. Now, something that I didn't have in the research that I've shown you today are attitudes like attitudes towards homosexuality, for example, or trans rights or the environment. These are all increasingly important. I didn't include them because we only have these measures in the last few years, not across the whole period that I looked at. But obviously, if we take these into account, these gaps would be even bigger because there is a lot of difference there. And parties have put a lot of effort into mobilizing voters based on these issues. I was just reading recently a report that said that the Greens' support isn't really because of their economic policy platform, but rather because of their progressive policies platform. And across young voters, these things do matter more than the economy, simply because they think that parties are the same on the economy, not really because they don't care about the economy, if that makes any sense. So the moment they might start seeing a difference, then the economy is always the top driving force, even across the youth. Even in the, like when I run my experiment, they cared a lot more about tuition fees and wages than they did about trans rights. But because they think that parties are all on the same page on tuition fees and wages, then they vote based on where they stand on trans rights. So I think that's going to be like the battlefield, I think, for the next election as well.
One other question I've sort of been itching to ask. What practical advice, based on your research, what practical advice would you give activists such as us all here today to use these insights in our day-to-day activist activities, especially folks sort of on the progressive left side of activism? Like
Yeah.
what, like how can these insights be harnessed?
Hmm. Well, I think that in the context of the voting age reform, one key area that activists and parties alike want to look at is enfranchising these young voters, even before they turn 18, so speaking to people who are still in school and starting to form their political opinions and trying to mobilize them in terms of these values that we know that these young people have, showing them not only that it's important to vote, but that there is a difference between parties. Whenever in my previous job, I used to go to schools a lot to do some political mobilization exercises, and the first thing that they say is, "Oh, they're all the same. Why should I care?" But we know that it's not true. So I think making that point really come across is especially important. In terms of what can be done with other age groups, I am honestly not too sure. But I think that because we see that generational changes tend to start from the youngest ones, I would really focus on what's going on with these voters and also why are they so unlikely to vote to begin with. I think that those are really the two key areas to work on before the next election.
Speaking of groups that are unlikely to vote, your work indicated that there's a large um, body of non-voting people who sort of are more authoritarian inclined, sort of a natural voting body that the right can draw from. I mean, sort of, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. I suppose this is a warning for folks on the left that not to take um, either left support for granted,
Mm.
but also that there is a large, and it looks like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it looks like there's a large untapped pool or body of voters that the right hasn't yet figured out how to mobilize, who are naturally inclined to support them based upon your work. Is that the case?
Yeah, 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 definitely. I mean, yeah, the people who have these values would either abstain or vote reform today. In many ways, reform support seems to have plateaued, like it's not really growing above the level it's at. So there is still a huge group of non-voters that could be mobilized, and I would be really interested in knowing why reform hasn't been able to do that. But this also suggests that there is space for other parties to go in and try to enfranchise these voters. Now, obviously, because these voters have authoritarian values, it would be difficult for a progressive party to do that. But again, considering that the main thing people care about is the economy and then other values come after that, maybe that is a way in, remarking upon how reform's economic policy platform isn't necessarily viable or beneficial for any of these voters, and focusing on that rather than on the things where there is disagreement between what these people believe and what the progressive parties believe.
But then there seems to be a strange paradox going on here where people say that the economic issues are the most important issues to them, but they're really voting on socio-cultural issues because that's where the choices are. That's where the big division is. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is the case. And I think, but unknowingly, the economy only becomes important when, I mean, people only start judging a party's economic policy platform when this party is in power. So at the moment, because Labour is in power, they do not think, they think that Labour's economic policy is exactly the same as the government before. Obviously, it's not, but people just don't have the technical expertise to evaluate these kind of policies. So the things that they focus on are things that are unrelated to the economy for that reason. And parties in opposition are in this luxury position where they can promise whatever they want about the economy, and they don't really have to pay the consequences if what they say makes absolutely no sense. And again, most people would not really know if it doesn't make any sense because it's not their job to evaluate economic policies. Things about, individuals' rights and freedoms are things where everyone feels comfortable having an opinion upon, whereas tax policy is much more complicated to get one's head around. So yeah, that's the nature, I guess, of every government. They've struggled to convince people why their economic policy was the best one, because you just don't see it as an individual. When you're struggling, you think, you can tell me whatever you want, but I cannot make it to the end of the month, and I couldn't with the government before either. So for them, it's all the same.
I want to hand it over to someone else to ask a question because I feel like I've been hogging the Q&A section so far. So if anyone else has got a question, please do ask, and then I think we can wrap it up with the end of presentation survey. Yeah. All right. In the meantime, wait, do we have one question? Nothing to ask, but this has been fascinating from Robin.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Robin.
Robin. I agree, it has been fascinating. Um, I'm going to launch the impact survey. So please fill out the poll. Uh, if everyone could do that, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, Laura. This is really, and yeah, just to repeat, Robin, this has really been fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cool. And then just a reminder to everyone, uh, I'm still in the process of organizing someone to present next month in April, but in May, we have got James Ackland again. He presented in January this year, this time on the ideological structure, the socio-economical dimensions of campaigns and how they shift during a campaign's life cycle. And then there's also a chance that in June, after the mid-year elections, we'll have Dr. Stephanie Luke will be back with her insights from the May elections. So yeah, please join us then. And watch your inbox. I'll keep you posted on something for April when that happens. And then we've got a few more folks that just need to fill out the poll, and then we'll be done. Okay. And I think that's everyone. Well, thank you so much, Laura. It has been fantastic. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.